So, good afternoon. Welcome. So today we're going to be working with, I had a difficult time kind of entitling this actually. So I thought these, guys coming out from the Andalus, whose music you were just listening to, and I thought philosophy from Al-Andalus. Of course, it's more poetic than descriptive. Philosophy is philosophy. It's come from different directions and places, and as I hope you'll see soon, it goes to the Andalus as much as it comes out of it, and goes to many places and comes out of it. But, these guys there are from Al-Andalus in that general sense. And their statues, the two I have there, I'm sorry, by the way, they didn't come out very well on the fly sheet, but that's what should have been on the fly sheet. Those statues are actually erected in Cordoba in modern-day Spain. So the authors we'll be dealing with today are Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd and Abu Imran Musa ibn Maymun, a.k.a. Maimonides, and Ibn Rushd, of course, a.k.a. Averroes. It's Ibn Maymun ibn Rushd, haram. And their respective texts that you'll be working with are the decisive treatise determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion for Ibn Rushd, and the Guide for the Perplexed by Ibn Maymun. Dalalat al-Ha'irin, the Guide for the Perplexed, and Kitab Fasl al-Maqal, وتقرير ما بين الحكمة والشريعة من اتصال. And the Arabic is very important from Ibn Rushd, and that's why I'm saying it. The translation usually is determining the nature of the connection between philosophy and religion. The Arabic is actually hikmah wa sharia, so it's more specific than this general philosophy and religion. I think anyway the translation you're working with by George Hourani has the title as On the Harmony, I think, all right? On the Harmony of Religion and Philosophy. Having already mentioned the terms religion, philosophy, and harmony, and determining, permit me first to begin today by, I'm going to ask you to indulge me with a slight digression. Before we talk about these two philosophers, falasifa, coming out from Al-Andalus, I want to go on a very, I hope, brief digression with you, take a few steps back before their time, and very briefly introduce, in an overview sense, the entry of philosophy in the sense of Greek philosophy, the entry of philosophy into the Arab Islamic world through translation movements and what is referenced as the Golden Age in Baghdad, and then onwards towards Al-Andalus and what these two authors are working with. And I believe you've already kind of touched upon that aspect in terms of rational thought and philosophy in your dealings and readings of Al-Ghazali and Ikhwan al-Safa, okay? So very briefly then, if one is to say a certain moment in time or a certain epoch that one speaks of falsafa i.e. the Greek philosophia coming into the Arab Islamic world, one normally thinks of the 9th century, common era 9th century Baghdad, where under the rule of Al-Ma'mun, son of Harun al-Rashid, you have a great rise of interest in the study of Greek philosophy and science, and not only Greek, of course, Indo-Asian, Persian. There was this really thriving moment in history in the region of translation and commentary and studies, and very rich, and bringing together texts and figures and translators and readers and commentators from all over the Islamicate, as I think the modern day reference now is, i.e. the Islamic world of the time. Indeed, this happened, and I need to emphasize, this has happened under the patronage of the rulers, of the Khulafa. They strongly supported it, they encouraged it. In fact, it is, for instance, reputed, rightly, wrongly, I don't know, that Al-Ma'mun himself would join in the discussions in Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad every Tuesday. And so this was a very lively scene, bringing together all this rich kind of heritage of science, right? Natural sciences, i.e., and astronomy and philosophy, all into this kind of beehive of translation and commentary in Baghdad at the time. Actually, I hesitate when I say science and philosophy. They're really, at the time, philosophy, right? It includes all of these kind of sub-categories we have in mind nowadays. Essentially, the general attitude that they were working with, of course, is that at bottom there is no contradiction and there's no conflict between what the philosophy and philosophers are putting across and proposing and what religion was also putting across. There was a kind of a general, what Hourani is calling in the title of the work, harmony. Right? And this was, for instance, very obviously put forth and supported by a great prominent figure of the time, Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, right, who fully believed that the philosophical reasoning was essential to help us understand and enlighten revelation. And you get a sense of that, I hope, with Ikhwan al-Safa, right, with the reading selections you have. Clearly they use a lot of philosophical language at certain points, even the humans, and they're not perhaps so good arguments in terms of we have traditional arguments and we have philosophical arguments, right? Now, perhaps naturally, historically naturally, the more traditionalist approaches, the ulama, were not very happy with this kind of coexistence between, the rationalistic, philosophical, and I mean here philosophical, i.e. Greek, right, philosophical heritage approaches, and the more traditionalist Islamic approaches, especially when you encounter people like, I know you haven't encountered them, but someone like Al-Farabi, for instance, who will go as far as saying that if any millah, if any religious community has had revelation and has not yet had philosophy, it must import philosophy in order to understand its revelation, right? They go rather far in certain of their stances as regards the centrality of philosophical reasoning in the context of revelation. And so there ends up a kind of almost an inevitable tension and perhaps a showdown between, if you wish, the kind of more traditionalist ulama, generally represented by the Hanbalites and the Malikites, and the philosophers and the more rationalistic ulama, represented usually by the Mu'tazila. And it is indeed a showdown, right, that translates itself into certain political implications and legal implications at some point. Then in the 10th century, the tide kind of changes in the locale we're talking about, the modern-day Iraq, Baghdad, Mosul area, with Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari coming onto the scene. He himself being an ex-Mu'tazila, and so he's very well grounded in the Mu'tazila kind of tradition. But he moves out of the Mu'tazila approach, and he kind of leads a charge against the overly rationalistic, and I insist, the overly rationalistic reading, not the rationalistic per se. In fact, one could say that what he was trying to do is to kind of bring or find a third ground between the two extremes of the traditionalist non-rational approach and the overly rational approach. And perhaps what al-Ash'ari was trying to do was to say, well, here's the middle ground where, yes, there are certain things we want to apply reason, but there are certain other things we don't want to. And I think you got a sense that, I hope, with your readings of Al-Ghazali, right, who's, of course, very much an Ash'arite in that work. In some sense, sorry, I wanted to show you some nice pictures, sorry. Forgot about them. So in some sense, you had the flourishing of science and philosophy, as I said, and again, science in all its forms. Here you have, some maritime kind of marine biology science. Of course, astronomy/astrology was very powerful. Mathematics, engineering, handasa, geometry was very central. And that was very much thriving, and in many ways that continued to be there. But as I was just saying, of course, the conflict came along, and in some sense, Al-Ghazali and the Ash'arites have been accused of putting an end to this scientific, philosophical drive in the Arab Islamic East. Whether that is an accurate accusation or not, really it's an open debate, and I'm not here, and I prefer to leave the question mark, because in some sense, even personages of their time, such as Ibn Rushd, would kind of level this kind of accusation on Al-Ghazali. On the other hand, not so sure it was that simple. Be that as it may, as this may have been happening in the Arab Eastern part of the world, with Al-Ghazali, it's really difficult after him to name any particular philosopher in that area. Of course, if you go to Persia, then of course there it flourishes and continues to flourish. We head westwards towards North Africa and Spain, where another story, in some sense different, in some sense similar, was also unfolding. In that part of the world, and in Andalus, we have at the beginnings a flourishing again of the studies of science and philosophy, and great support for the sciences and the study of philosophy, particularly with the early rulers who were the remnants of the Umayyads, who had taken position there in modern-day Spain, in Cordoba. And in fact, Al-Hakam II, for instance, was who was the second Umayyad Caliph in Cordoba, was one of the key figures in promoting the study, and promoting the translation and importation of the books to Cordoba, very much becoming a cultural center, if you wish. It is, in fact, reputed that at one point there was, over 400,000 manuscripts in that library he had commissioned in Cordoba. And very much at some point one says, the Andalus and Cordoba has kind of started to rival Baghdad in its heyday. And that continued for a while, that support and patronage. But then at one point, again, as I guess happens, back and forth, the tide shifted with the coming on of another dynasty, which defeated, before the coming on of his son, of Al-Hakam's son, who was underage, and so there was a steward appointed by his mother to govern in the meantime. And that steward, Al-Mansur, was very much not in approval of science and philosophy, and in fact, at one point he organized the public burnings of books which Al-Hakam II had so meticulously collected and put together in that library. But that didn't last long. Soon you have the coming on of the Muwahhidun dynasty in the mid of the 20th century. 12th century. That was a huge fast forward. In the 12th century. And with whom it was a very interesting age in Cordoba, because in principle, the Muwahhidun dynasty outwardly was a very conservative dynasty and built itself on rather conservative theology. In fact, a theology that considered Ahmad ibn Hanbal not to be strict enough in some cases. And at the same time, as rulership, they propagated and they promoted and they supported the study of the sciences and philosophy, and there was a kind of if you wish, an implicit understanding between them and the scientists and the falasifa, that this will flourish, will continue, but in the closed circles, not in front of the children. Yeah? Don't go out to the populace with these ideas and these discussions, but definitely keep it going. And so it was an interesting time, actually, if you look at the surface reading of the kind of theology that governed the Muwahhidun, you would imagine there's no way philosophy and science would thrive under them. But in fact it did, and it was a very interesting dichotomy that some may suggest that Ibn Tufayl, for instance, captures in one of his works, his main surviving work, Hayy ibn Yaqdan. So, that was a very, I hope, brief interlude, but my main point there is to say, as we get now to our two authors for today, Ibn Rushd and Ibn Maymun, they're coming up from this long tradition of a debate in philosophy, the role of philosophy again meaning Greek philosophy here, the role of philosophy, the place of philosophy in a monotheistic context, if any. And in some sense, and this is particularly so in the readings from Ibn Rushd, you sense an insistence on defending the role and place of philosophy in an Arab Islamic or Islamic monotheistic context. Maybe not so much with Musa ibn Maymun, but I think it's also there at some levels of insisting on the need for philosophy, if not a defense of it, although that could easily translate. Otherwise, we will be, as the author of his work suggests, perplexed without it. We, of course, will see who the we is. Is it everybody? Is it some few people? So we'll see. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to go very, very briefly bios of each and then delve into the works and look at key elements and key passages, if you wish, from their works to highlight what it is they were doing precisely with these works as regards philosophy and its relation to a monotheistic discussion in both these texts. Right? So Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, born in 1126 in Cordoba, comes from a very prominent family of physicians and sociopolitically engaged, if you wish, and legal also family, legal in the Sharia sense. So he studied Maliki law and Ash'ari Kalam and philosophy and medicine and mathematics. And in many ways, he was a polymath of his time. In 1153, there was a very interesting, historically for us interesting, meeting between him and Ibn Tufayl. Ibn Tufayl, by the way, is considered to be one of the great kind of Andalusian philosopher characters. Ibn Bajjah perhaps the first, Ibn Tufayl the second, and then you get Ibn Rushd and Maimonides. But Ibn Tufayl had an interesting role in the court at the time. He was a bit like a scout. Those of you who follow football, you know football scouts, right? They look for talents. And there was the ruling body of the time was really interested in attracting more and more of these talents, so to speak, to the court. And so Ibn Tufayl had identified Ibn Rushd as a great talent, and he introduced him to the ruler of the time. And then he, through that introduction, he was at one point commissioned to write commentaries on Aristotle, because as we are told, Abu Yaqub Yusuf was trying to read Aristotle and found certain difficulties, and so he wanted someone to present commentaries on the text. He had originally asked Ibn Tufayl to do it, but Ibn Tufayl admitted he was rather busy with writing his great work, Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, and so he asked Ibn Rushd instead, which is a great happy accident in history, which brought Ibn Rushd to the forefront, so to speak, of academia in our day and research in his day, writing on Aristotle and his own works. But not only was he a physician, a philosopher, but very importantly and very interestingly, he was also a judge. And again, a judge as in Sharia, right? A legal religious judge. And then at one point he was appointed Qadi Qudat, chief judge. And I insist on this, and I keep it in mind when we get to Maimonides, who was also a rabbi, and then at one point an Agib, i.e. the prince of his Jewish community. Because both of these authors that you're dealing with are philosophers and proponents of philosophy in their respective communities, but they are also figures in the religious community, very solid figures, right? I mean, when you speak about Qadi Qudat, and when you speak about a rabbi and a high priest, so to speak, both of whom are insisting on the place and role of philosophy, then you get, I think, a rather interesting debate in their texts. For whatever reason, we have plenty of stories on that. In 1195, he seems to have fallen from grace and lost the patronage of the court, and he chose exile and died in Marrakesh in 1198. Musa ibn Maymun, somewhat similar, but not really. I mean, but again, both of them have this exile problematic, though he doesn't last in Cordoba as much as our friend Ibn Rushd. So at one point in Cordoba, the dhimmi status was abolished. In other words, the status of non-Muslims to stay and pay a tax was abolished, and the option was left, either they convert or they leave. And apparently, from whatever records we have, Maimonides' family chose to leave. And for quite a while, they hung around southern Spain and then went to Morocco and studied there, Maimonides. And again, he studied very much the Greek classics as they had been brought forth by the Arab translators and commentators, including Ibn Rushd himself. Became a great figure in terms of his community when he finally chose exile and went to Egypt, and he was appointed the prince of the Jewish community there, the leader of the Jewish community, a very well-established physician. So again, a common point with our friend Ibn Rushd. He wrote quite a few treatises actually on medicine, and he was appointed court physician to Salah ad-Din at one point, and then in fact remained the royal physician after the passing of Salah ad-Din. And he died in 1204 in Egypt. So this is who you're reading. Let us now move on to what you're reading, right? And you have two selections you're covering. One from Ibn Rushd, which is, as I already briefly presented, the Decisive Treatise. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a copy of a manuscript of the Decisive Treatise itself, but that's one of his commentaries, been seen as a poem on medicine. And I need to start off by the following very important note. This is not a philosophical work by Ibn Rushd. This is a work on philosophy. Right? In other words, this isn't what you will not really get to see much of Ibn Rushd's own philosophical worldview in this work, because that's not why it was written. Its purpose is very clear, and its purpose is almost legal. And he approaches the question, as you will see in a minute, from the question of religious law, right? And what he wants to do is to determine the nature of the connection between hikmah and sharia in the Arabic, translated here as religion and philosophy. He will, of course, put across some of the issues, but he's not so much concerned with presenting his own philosophical worldview here. With Ibn Maymun, you get more of that. Particularly since his target audience is different. Another thing I'd like you to keep in mind in reading the decisive treatise is that he is responding to particular wave of attacks against philosophy, and so it is a defensive treatise. He has in mind Al-Ghazali. Don't take my word for it. He names him. Right? He says Abu Hamid, right? None other. But he also has in mind Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Right? And what's interesting about this work is that for Ibn Rushd, he believes, and he argues, sorry, I shouldn't say believes, he argues that a lot of damage has been done to philosophy and its status, hikmah and its status in the Islamic world. That damage having been done from two directions, from those who oppose it, as well as from those who propagate it. And he does have an issue with some of the things that Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi put forth, which of course are explicitly named in Al-Ghazali's work that you've covered, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. So he's not defending the falasifa, he's defending philosophy, right? And keep that in mind. And as I said, his approach is rather legalistic. And he begins the text by raising the following question. We need to determine the attitude, the stance of the law, and again, law, as in religious law. Whenever we say that, whenever Ibn Rushd says that, it's not civic law, yeah? It's religious law, sharia. So we need to determine the stance and the attitude of religious law towards philosophy. What does that mean? That means, does religious law forbid it, allow it, or command it? Right? And this is a central question. And you note, he's not beginning as a philosopher. He's beginning as a legal Muslim jurist who's saying, what does Islamic religious law say about philosophy? Because if it forbids it, that's it. Right? End of story. Done. Right? And then he proposes this. He says, if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indications of the artisan, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, then, right, logical conclusion, it is clear that what this name, philosophy, signifies is either obligatory or recommended by law. Right? Very simple, two premises, possible conclusion. Right? If that's what philosophy does, and if the law asks us to do that, then the law either allows or commands philosophy. So we'll start with the second issue here. If the law has encouraged and urged reflections on beings, does the law, religious law, encourage and urge reflection upon beings? For Ibn Rushd, it's a clear yes. And again, don't take his word for it. He references a number of verses and a number of key points in the scripture, in the Holy Quran, that clearly suggests that God is calling upon us to reflect upon beings, right? And he gives these examples. He says, what about the verse that says, reflect, you have vision? And that's an imperative. Reflect here as a fa'al amr, right? Reflect. And then, have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? And he says, if you look at these two verses, one seems to be an imperative and one seems to be an encouragement. Right? So one seems to require it and one seems to allow it or encourage it. But if you have, in legal kind of language, if one attitude is a requirement and the second is encouragement, then the higher one is the one you go with, the requirement. Good? Right? And so he says, if you look at this, then it would seem that actually, and this and of course other examples he is willing to present, it seems that we are actually required, we are commanded to reflect upon beings. Okay? Of course, that's not the same as saying study philosophy yet. Right? We're still at the level of, does the law command us to study beings, to reflect upon beings, beings as in mawjudat, al-makhluqat? He says yes, it does that. All right, how do you bring in philosophy into that? He says, well, if we're asked to reflect, what is reflection? He says reflection is nothing more than inference and drawing out the unknown from the known. Right? That's reflection. And since this is reasoning, or at any rate done by reasoning, therefore we are under the obligation to carry our study of beings by intellectual reasoning. Okay? So the law commands us to reflect. What is reflection? Well, it's inferring the unknown from the known. And what do you do that with? Well, you're reasoning. Well, there you go then. Intellectual reasoning. Good? So now you can say, well, the law commands us to reflect. In other words, the law commands us to carry out our study of beings by intellectual reasoning. Good. And where do we begin in doing so? Where do we begin in any science? According to Ibn Rushd, to expect or to ask that we begin from ground zero, to ask that we start from nothing, is a bit counterintuitive. In all sciences, in all human investigations, we look at what's already been done in the field and start from there. Right? Whether in mathematics, whether in medicine, or whether in intellectual reasoning. So if others have already done work in this, let's see what they've done. Right? And of course, those who have already done work in this are the philosophers, right? In the books of philosophy. Right? So you see how this now leads us to intellectual reasoning. Why? Why do I need to say, well, intellectual reasoning, okay, I guess I need to go back and start with the books of philosophy? Because intellectual reasoning is a particular exercise with particular requirements, says Ibn Rushd. To carry out your study through intellectual reasoning and to do so properly, one has to know what it means to do intellectual reasoning. One has to know the various methods of intellectual reasoning. One has to know the various premises, the various modes of reasoning, right? Basically, in modern language, you want the logic, the course on logic, right? Introduction to logic, to be able to distinguish between valid arguments and invalid arguments, between sound arguments and unsound arguments. What is a premise? How does this premise work to this conclusion, right? It's a science. It's a study. And so if I'm going to do my reflection and study of beings by intellectual reasoning, then I need to study intellectual reasoning, right? The methods of intellectual reasoning, and apparently that's already been done by none other, of course, than Aristotle and the Aristotelian school. So we need to go and study those and start from those. In other words, and of course it's a more elaborate argument, but I'm summarizing it for you, and that's on your fly sheet as well. In other words, I can follow through the following kind of flow of the argument, pardon. So as we've already established, the law obliges us to study beings and reflect upon them, right? This is, according to Ibn Rushd, very clear by textual reference, not because I, Ibn Rushd, said so. In order to do that, I need to do it through intellectual reasoning, which means I need to understand and study the rules and principles of reasoning, which means I have to go and study the works of those before us who have done work in the field, right? Now that I've done that, now that I've learned the rules and methods of intellectual reasoning, I can go back to reflecting upon beings. And as we said, if there are others who have done that reflection, we need to start from there. We can't start from ground zero. And this means one has to study what those before us have done in this field, just like with any other field. And therefore, the law obliges us to study philosophy. Not allows us, commands us. Right? And the Arabic he uses is مأمور به على جهة الوجوب. Very strong conclusion, especially to those who don't like philosophy and say, what? Are you saying it's a religious, legal obligation that I need to study philosophy? Are you for real? And of course he is saying that. But then there's an additional qualification for those who can. Right? And this is a qualification that applies to any religious commandment, of course, right? Whatever is commanded religiously is commanded for those who can. So yes, for those who can, they must. For those who can't, that's okay, don't worry, right? And this can and can't means he has to introduce some understanding of different capacities of human intellectual capacities. Right? Sorry for the redundancy. In other words, there are those who can and those who can't. And he says, yes, that's not me again. That's in the Word of God himself. He says there are different natural capacities. Well, he doesn't say that, but he does say, ادع إلى سبيل ربك. Right? He does say, summon to the way of your Lord by wisdom, by preaching, and by debate. And so for Ibn Rushd, these are three different methods. There's wisdom, there's preaching, and there's debate, which he translates into three different capacities. An intellectual capacity that can apprehend things through wisdom, another that arrives at what, all of this, what he calls arriving at tasdeeq, at assent to religious truth, right? Another that arrives to religious truth through what he calls dialectical reasoning, right? And the third, that is the rhetorical reasoning, khutaba. Okay? So for those who can, the law obliges us to study philosophy. Good? A very strong conclusion. From this, he turns the defense of the place and role of philosophy into an attack on those who want to deny us philosophy, such as Abu Hamid. Although he says his heart might have been in the right place, his intentions might have been, nice, but he ends up doing something which is the following. If the law commands me to study philosophy, if I can, then whoever forbids me from that is actually stopping me from fulfilling the law. Right? Whoever forbids the study of them to anyone who is fit to study them, you see, this qualification, not to everyone, to those fit to study them, which he summarizes here. Anyone who unites two qualities, natural intelligence, ذكاء الفطرة, and religious integrity and moral virtue. So anyone who blocks the access to study philosophy for those who can, is blocking people from the door by which the law summons them to the knowledge of God. And such an act is the extreme of ignorance and estrangement from God the Exalted. So he goes from defending the role and place of philosophy from a legal grounding to turning that to an attack on anyone who would forbid me or block my access to them. Such as, of course, there's many you can mention, but such as Abu Hamid, and he names him more than one place in the text. Then he goes on to address a number of things, which of course I'm not going to go into. I'll leave that in-depth reading for your classes. But essentially what Ibn Rushd wants to do at the end of the day is, in some sense, to rehabilitate, or to kind of bring back very clearly and strongly the role of philosophy, the centrality of philosophy in, as he says, the law summons them to the knowledge of God. Right? So he connects it directly to this kind of higher level knowledge. Which is for him very central. And in that he believes, as I preluded saying, that the philosophers have done damage to philosophy as much as those who oppose it. Right? And that's why in this text you will find that he will respond, for instance, to the three counts of unbelief that Al-Ghazali outlines in Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, and the deliverance from error. Right? The eternality of the world, the knowledge of God is only of universals, and the resurrection of soul. Ibn Rushd will respond to those, but he will respond to those accusations not to defend Al-Farabi or Ibn Sina or whoever, Abu Bakr al-Razi, but to defend philosophy and to say very clearly, and I'll leave it at that yes, is it possible for a philosopher to commit errors? Of course. But those errors are not in philosophy. They are in the philosophical investigation, in the student, right? And I'll leave it at that. Look at the very central distinction that he makes between essential error and accidental error. In conclusion, the final part of the essay that you're reading from him really sums it up and really sums up the role, the purpose of this work, right? Where he says, in a really very honest kind of conclusion, he says, our soul is in the utmost sorrow and pain by reason of the evil fancies and perverted beliefs which have infiltrated religion, and particularly such afflictions, evil fancies, as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim an affinity with philosophy. Injuries from people related to philosophy are the severest to religion. Right? So he clearly says there have been injuries done by people in philosophy. But religion, has also been hurt by a host of ignorant friends who claim an affinity with it. These are the sects which exist within it. Right? So this is what's driving this work, to kind of defend the role and place of philosophy. But in doing that, and keep that in mind, in doing that, for Ibn Rushd, if I'm defending philosophy, I'm defending the tool that will help me properly understand revelation. So indirectly, I'm also defending religion. I'm defending revelation. Good? Which is kind of what our next friend, Musa ibn Maymun, also has in mind when he writes the Guide for the Perplexed. Because the perplexity here has to also do, as you'll see, with this kind of understanding of revelation, making sense of certain, literary things in revelation. Particularly, he says, for someone who is religious, but has also mastered philosophy. Because in some sense, he says, you will end up at a point where it's almost as if you have to choose either rational truth or revealed truth, at least as you read it in the surface. So in the prefatory remarks for the works, Maimonides says, my primary object in this work is to explain certain words occurring in the prophetic books, right, which sounds like a very small task, but as you'll see, it's a huge thing. It is not here intended to explain all these expressions to the unlettered or to mere tyros, novices, a previous knowledge of logic and natural philosophy being indispensable. Right? So in other words, in order to understand the words of revelation, a previous knowledge of logic and natural science, natural philosophy, is a must. Or to those who confine their attention to the study of our holy law, I mean the study of the canonical law alone. For the true knowledge of the Torah is the special aim of this and similar works. So that's what he's aiming to do, to truly understand the Torah. And then he goes further. He says, the object of this treatise is to enlighten a religious man who has been trained to believe in the truth of our holy law, who conscientiously fulfills his moral and religious duties, and at the same time has been successful in his philosophical studies. Human reason has attracted him to abide within its spheres, and he finds it difficult to accept as correct the teaching based on the literal interpretation of the law. And keep this in mind, the notion of interpretation as you're reading Ibn Rushd, because he fully focuses on the necessity of interpreting certain texts of revelation. So to accept as correct the teaching based on the literal interpretation of the law, and especially that which he himself or others derive from those homonyms, metaphorical or hybrid expressions. Hence, he is lost in perplexity and anxiety. Furthermore, he says, this work has also a second object in view. It seeks to explain certain obscure figures which occur in the prophets and are not distinctly characterized as being figures. Ignorant and superficial readers take them in a literal, not in a figurative sense. Even well-informed persons are bewildered if they understand these passages in their literal signification, but they are entirely relieved of their perplexity when we explain the figure or merely suggest that the terms are figurative. For this reason, I have called this book Guide for the Perplexed. Right? So perplexities as regards revelation, the tool to help us deal with these perplexities come to us from philosophy. And both with Ibn Rushd and with Maimonides, it's really specifically Aristotelian philosophy. And you will see how big Aristotle will factor for these guys, and then later in the scholastic tradition, which you'll come to later on. So the work you're reading is a selection of, I think, chapters 50, 51 to 60, but it's a huge work in itself. And basically, these are the main sections. You're reading selections from part 1, which has 76 chapters, right? In which he basically discusses the homonyms. You know what homonym means, by the way? Right? A synonym, you know what a synonym is? Okay. A homonym is not the opposite, it's a different thing. A homonym is one word, the same word that has different meanings. Okay? And homonymity is a big issue for a lot of these philosophers, all the way from Al-Kindi, Farabi, Ibn Sina, to Maimonides, Ibn Rushd. Because one of the problems of reading revelation and reading philosophy is homonymity, to understand the term in a certain way when it doesn't mean that. Right? And of course, figuration is another thing he discusses. So he will focus a lot on homonymity, what these words could mean, particularly in talking about God. Right? So God is loving. What does that mean, he says? Right? You'll see that very clearly in your readings. as well as philosophical and geometric terms such as figure, space, and time and form. Of course, the most pertinent discussion, as I said, has to do with speaking about God, which we'll get to in a minute. I hope, yes, we have time, good. Okay, the second part comprises 26 philosophical propositions and 48 chapters. So the second part begins with listing first principles of reason, right? Something cannot be itself and not itself at the same time, right? All these kind of clear premises that he will use in the coming chapters. So again, you'll note how philosophy is at the heart of whatever he's going to do in terms of setting the grounds as premises, what he's going to be using in his arguments. And the third part, which has an introduction of 54 chapters, is to many within the Jewish tradition and as well as the philosophical tradition, perhaps one of the most interesting and controversial ones, particularly the first 7 chapters, in which he reads one of those references in the Torah to the chariot of Ezekiel, which in Judaic tradition should not be interpreted and cannot be interpreted, that scene. And so he attempts to put forth a possible explanation of the figure of the chariot and all of that, using everything that's preceded philosophically. And then he goes on to talk about more about the laws and explaining the laws and the problem of evil and whatnot, right? So it's a very much a text rooted in monotheistic Judaic discussion, trying to understand certain things in the Torah, trying to understand what it means when we say God is such and so, right? And this is very much related to the discussion of the time that he's very familiar with, by the way, which is the discussion on the beautiful names of God and the discussion on whether someone can speak of God or about God and etc. And you'll see this in the selections you're reading. But he also actually dedicates the end of part 1, you're not reading that part, but the end of part 1 is actually dedicated to rejecting the arguments of mutakallimun, of kalam. And kalam here meant both the Judaic and the Islamic. He was very well versed in both. Okay, so in brief then, of course this is the purpose of the whole work, which by the way was dedicated to a particular student of his. He has a dedicatory letter at the beginning. Is to address these perplexities and to do so by highlighting the role and place of philosophy, of reasoning, philosophical reasoning, Aristotelian philosophical reasoning specifically, right? So unlike with Ibn Rushd's reading that you have, here with Maimonides you will encounter his philosophy. You will encounter how he's using philosophy to address these particular questions. And the central question that is raised in your readings is, what does it mean to speak about the qualities or the attributes or the characteristics of God? Can I even do that? Can I say God is merciful and mean that it is the essence of God that he is merciful? Right? Can I say anything of God? Right? And this is a question, because that was part of the debate of the time, whether what we say about God is saying things about his essential qualities, or whether we actually speak about God in the sense we actually know these qualities to be of God, in God, to be God, right? So these are the kind of questions he's raising. What does it mean to speak about God? Okay. Can we speak about God? Of course, speak, I mean philosophically, to know that God is such and so. And this is based on a most basic monotheistic premise. That God is simple unity, right? That God is one, and not one in a numerical sense, not one in any unitary kind of what we close our eyes and imagine one to be, but one in the sense of non-compound, indivisible, immaterial, etc. Right? There cannot be any belief in the unity of God except by admitting he is one simple substance without any composition or plurality of elements. He's not made up of parts. Right? This is for Maimonides, this is basic monotheistic, what it means to say God is one. One from whatever side you view it, and by whatever test you examine it, not divisible into two parts in any way and by any cause, nor capable of any form of plurality, either objectively or subjectively, as will be proved in this treatise. Right? And what does that mean? Well, if it cannot be thought of as divisible, and if it cannot be thought of as compound, what does it mean for me then to say that God is omnipresent and omniscient and omnipotent? Or what does it mean to then say that God is loving and merciful and, forgiving and whatnot, right? Because we say that. Never mind what we say, says Ibn Maymun. The Torah says that. I mean, there are clear verses in the Torah that want to speak about God. And this is where he's worried about homonyms. Are we really speaking about God? How do I understand those passages? Right? How do I understand those passages, especially in light of the encounter, quote unquote, between Moses and God? Not this Moses, not Moses Maimonides, Moses, right? Where he relates the story to us, Ibn Maymun, and he says, when Moses asked God to show him his face, to know him, God says, you cannot know me, but you will know my actions, my works, right? And then we have, so on the one hand, we have clear textual presentation that we cannot know, what Moses cannot know, the divine, and then we have all these references about what the divine is. So I need to understand them, right? And that's when he says in the first object is to explain these terms. Those are the terms he's talking about, the terms that reference God, that speak about God. Now you will notice that in his approach is actually purely philosophical. So as he sets down this premise, then he says, all right, let's see whether we can actually speak of, and what it means to speak of the divine in terms of speaking of its essence, understanding it, right? He says to speak about anything, every description of an object by an affirmative attribute, affirmative i.e. that it is such and so, which includes the assertion that an object of a certain kind must be made in one of the following 5 ways. And these are the 5 philosophic ways of speaking about something, right? Defining it, describing it. And so what he'll do now is he'll go through these 5 ways and see whether any of them apply when speaking about God, right? So the first way to speak about something is description by definition. In other words, an explanation of a name containing the true essence of the object, right? So that human is a mortal being. Okay? The human is a being, and it's mortal. Good? So to speak of the definition of something, how can one speak of the definition of God? Or can one speak of the definition of God? Right? God is God. Which is not saying much. So that obviously, that won't work. We don't have access to that. Right? All agree, he says, that this kind of description cannot be given of God, for there are no previous causes to his existence by which he could be defined. Now, what does that mean? Let me go back to my example of the human is a mortal being. If you know, when I say the human is a mortal being, being has to pre-exist humanity, the possibility of being. And mortality also. Right? So now if I say God is absolute justice, suppose I want to use that term, am I saying that justice pre-exists, previous cause to his existence? Of course not. Monotheistically that won't work, to have anything pre-God. Even if I say God is, right? As in, is what? Has being? Does that mean being right? I'm not going to push the argument or presentation any further. I think it's clear why this won't work, right? Well, we have another approach. We have an approach which can speak about something by part of its definition. Okay, so the human is a rational animal, right? Animal is one part, rational is another part. Good? Okay, I can't speak about God in definition, but maybe I can reference parts of his definition. What's the problem with that? Good? But we just started by premising that it is indivisible, it's not compound, it has no parts, right? Any approach to speak about God in parts is ridiculous. That simply goes against our very monotheistic premise that God is simple unity. Good, thank you. I'm just checking the time. I think time's up. Okay, so very briefly, then he goes through the 3 other ways. I'll spoil it for you. None of these work, right? The third way is describing something by accidental qualities, right? The chair is blue. Well, obviously that won't work. God cannot have accidental qualities attached to God. You can't really speak about God in terms of relation to things. We are here, I am Naya's father, you are taking CVSP 202. Again, you can't really do that with God because, again, that would mean God and something, and God in relation to that something, but there's nothing outside of God that you can relate in that context. The fifth way is the actions, maybe. In other words, what God does, or speaking about God's actions rather than speaking about God. Yeah, fine. But that's not speaking about God, and therefore that's not knowing God. That's speaking about his actions, right? I'll just close off with this. Conclusion for Maimonides, as he addresses the student, he says, what this leads me to is the following, that you have to know that the negative attributes of God are the true attributes. In other words, what God is not. They do not include any incorrect notions or any deficiency whatever in the reference to God, while positive attributes imply polytheism. Look at this really strong claim. And are inadequate, as we have already shown. So if one is to speak about the divine, the only way, says Maimonides, is to speak about what God is not, and we cannot speak about what God is. Good? So any possible knowledge of God is simply knowing what God is not. And I'll leave you with that. Enjoy the readings. Have a lovely afternoon.